Imagine for a moment that you have just been handed the ultimate promotion. Like, you've been given the title of king or queen.
Right, the absolute top of the ladder.
Exactly. The crown is placed on your head, the heavy velvet robes are, draped over your shoulders, and you walk over to the highest tower of your castle to look out over your vast new domain.
But then you look out the window and a terrifying reality sets in.
Yeah, your entire kingdom is just this tiny, incredibly vulnerable patch of land. And surrounding this little patch of land are, well, heavily armed warlords.
Right, and technically, according to the official org chart, these warlords answer to you.
Technically. But in reality, I mean, they have way more money, way more land, and vastly larger armies than you could ever hope to muster.
You are a monarch in name only.
Completely surrounded by people who could, frankly, crush you before breakfast if they felt like it.
It is the ultimate imposter syndrome, you know? Except the stakes aren't just a bruised ego. The stakes are literal life and death.
Yeah, which is a terrifying place to be. Welcome to this deep dive into the source material, everyone. Today, we are tracing the explosive, highly unlikely, and incredibly dramatic arc of the House of Capet.
The Capetians.
Right. We're pulling from a massive stack of historical encyclopedias, dynastic records, and deep historical analyses to understand the central tension of this one specific family.
And our mission today is to figure out how they seized power from absolutely nothing.
Exactly. How they legitimized their rule through brilliant myth-making, highly strategic marriages, and how, after centuries of success, they ultimately trigger their own catastrophic downfall.
Because these weren't just old guys in crowns. The Capetians were, they were political survivalists. They pulled off one of the greatest long cons in medieval history.
A total long con. And to truly understand how they managed this unprecedented survival, we have to examine their reign through two very distinct lenses, right?
Yeah, we are going to look at the gritty institutional politics of state building, how you actually forge a unified nation out of total chaos.
And we're also going to look closely at the intimate family dynamics, the potent symbolism and the cultural legacy that kept that crown firmly on their heads for, what, over 300 years?
Over 3 centuries, yeah. Unbroken.
Crazy.
Yeah.
So I was looking at the timeline in our sources, and to understand where these guys come from, we have to start at this major transition point in the 10th century.
The fading of the Carolingians.
Right, the Carolingian dynasty, which is the legendary bloodline of Charlemagne, it's fading fast. And the description of 10th century France in the reading sounds like an absolute nightmare.
Oh, it was brutal.
I saw a mention of Vikings literally sailing right up the Seine River, like right into the heart of the country.
It was an era of profound vulnerability. I mean, the sources point specifically to figures like Rollo. He was a Viking chieftain who was navigating his longboats deep into Frankish territory in the early 900s.
Wow.
And the central royal authority, the Carolingian kings, they simply couldn't mobilize armies fast enough to protect these disparate towns and villages from these rapid, brutal raids.
Which fundamentally changes how society organizes itself, right? Because if the king can't protect you, you have to find someone who can.
Exactly. That is the exact mechanism that births the feudal system as we know it.
Right.
Local lords realized they needed immediate, localized defense, so they started building castles. And initially, these weren't the grand stone fortresses of later centuries.
Just mud and wood, right.
Yeah, they were wooden motte and bailey structures. But they provided a physical safe haven. And in exchange for this protection, the local villagers swore fealty to the Lord, offering their labor and a portion of their harvest.
The total protection racket.
Pretty much. Over a few generations, this led to a highly decentralized, fractured land where the local magnates, these regional warlords, held all the real cards because they controlled the immediate physical security of the people.
So the idea of a unified France is basically a total fiction at this point.
Complete fiction. I mean, communication was rudimentary, far worse than it had been in the Roman days, centuries prior. Government was entirely local.
And didn't the readings say they didn't even speak the same language?
Right. The people across this geographic area didn't share a common tongue at all. You had Celtic spoken in Brittany, Germanic dialects along the eastern borders, Flemish in the north.
Wow.
And dozens of distinct local Romance dialects everywhere else. To put this in perspective for you, imagine if your state governor suddenly had a larger personal army, a richer treasury, and spoke a totally different language than the federal government.
That is wild.
That's the reality of the French monarchy in the 10th century.
Okay, so right in the middle of this fractured, terrifying landscape, the last Carolingian king, Louis V, who, by the way, was literally known as Louis the Lazy.
Or the do-nothing.
Right, the do-nothing. He dies in a hunting accident in the forest of Celes in 987,
Yeah.
and he leaves no children.
A huge problem.
Right, so the great nobles of the realm have to elect a new king.
Ah.
And going by the reading, by all rights of blood and hereditary legitimacy, it should have been Charles of Lorraine, the legitimate Carolingian heir.
It absolutely should have been.
But instead, they elect this guy named Hugh Capet.
Yeah, Hugh Capet was the great-grandson of a powerful magnate named Robert the Strong, representing a family we later call the Robertians. But at the time of his election in 987, Hugh was essentially just a glorified local lord.
Okay, let's unpack this, because it seems wildly counterintuitive unless you look at it from the noble's perspective.
Right.
Comparing Hugh Capet's situation to a modern corporate scenario is highly instructive here. Imagine a board of directors that wants to run the company however they please, without any interference.
They want total freedom.
Exactly. They aren't going to hire a visionary, powerful CEO. They're going to hire a figurehead. They give Hugh the fancy title, but they hand him absolutely no budget, no executive power, and a mandate that basically says, don't actually try to change anything we do.
That is exactly the dynamic. The Dukes of Normandy, Burgundy, and Aquitaine were practically independent sovereigns. They elected Hugh specifically because his power base was incredibly small.
He was weak.
Extremely weak. Hugh only directly controlled a tiny royal domain, roughly 400 square miles around Paris and Orleans. He didn't have the resources to tell the Duke of Aquitaine what to do, let alone force him to do it.
But Hugh survives. And that's what's so fascinating to me. How do you survive and solidify your position when you have zero real military or economic power to coerce these giant warlords?
Well, you have to change the rules of the game. Hugh realized very quickly that if he couldn't beat them with swords or gold, he had to beat them with ideas and symbolism.
Soft power.
Exactly. He relied heavily on the church. The Archbishop of Reims, a man named Adalberon, championed Hugh's election. Adalberon famously declared to the assembled nobles that the throne is not acquired by hereditary right, but by goodness of soul.
Goodness of soul. That feels like an incredibly convenient argument to make when you are explicitly trying to bypass the guy who has the actual hereditary right.
Oh, it is entirely convenient, but it was also incredibly effective because it shifted the foundation of royal power. It wasn't about Carolingian blood anymore. It was about divine approval.
Right.
And once Hugh is elected, the church injects a massive dose of powerful mythology into his coronation to solidify this new foundation. According to the lore that was heavily promoted around the Capetians, Hugh wasn't just crowned, he was anointed.
With the holy oil.
Yes, and not just with any oil.
Right. The sources detail this holy oil that had supposedly been brought down directly from heaven by a dove, specifically by Saint Remigius, 5 centuries earlier, for the baptism of Clovis, the first king of the Franks.
Exactly. By anointing Hugh with this specific chrism, the church was physically tying his body to the most sacred ancient roots of Frankish divine right.
It's brilliant PR.
It is, and the mythology goes even deeper. Following this anointing, Hugh was credited with a supernatural ability.
Oh, right. The healing thing.
Yes, he was said to be able to cure scrofula, a terrible, disfiguring skin disease of the lymph nodes known commonly as the king's evil.
Just by touching the afflicted person.
Simply by the royal touch.
Talk about a brilliant branding strategy. I mean, if you're Hugh, you can't raise a tax army to intimidate the peasants. But if you can convince them you literally have magic healing hands bestowed by God, you create a level of reverence that a sword just can't buy.
Exactly. It creates a protective aura. You might be a weak king militarily, but to rebel against you isn't just treason anymore, it's sacrilege. It's a sin against God's anointed healer.
Wow.
Furthermore, the sources detail a very potent piece of propaganda regarding a prophecy. Sometime before he was crowned king, Hugh supposedly recovered the stolen relics of St. Valerie from the Flemings.
Okay.
As a reward, the saint appeared to Hugh in a dream and promised that his descendants would rule as kings to the 7th generation.
The medieval PR machine was working overtime. I read that Hugh actually refused to wear his royal robes and insignia in daily life.
Yeah.
Supposedly hoping that by showing extreme humility to God, he could, negotiate an extra generation on the throne for his family.
Yeah, whether he actually believed it or it was purely performative, it reinforced the narrative that his power was a divine burden, not a greedy usurpation.
Right.
But what's fascinating here is that we must give Hugh credit. He didn't just rely on divine PR and magic oil. He executed a masterstroke of political survival that historians call anticipatory association.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is the move that changes everything. Walk us through how this worked.
So Hugh knew that the monarchy he inherited was technically elective. The nobles had just proven that by electing him instead of the Carolingian heir.
Right, they literally just did it.
Exactly. So if Hugh died suddenly, which was highly probable in the 10th century, the nobles would just convene and elect someone else. Maybe they'd go back to the Carolingians.
Or just pick another weak guy.
Right. Hugh needed to strip the nobles of that choice without them realizing what he was doing. So in the exact same year he was crowned, 987, he manufactures a crisis.
Let me guess. A sudden, urgent military threat.
Precisely. He claimed he was planning a dangerous, necessary military expedition against Moorish armies that were supposedly harassing the Count of Barcelona, who was technically a vassal of the French crown.
Oh, clever.
Hugh argued to the nobles that the stability of the realm required a backup king just in case he rode south and died in battle.
But he never actually went on this military campaign, did he?
He never marched a single soldier south.
Unbelievable.
But the threat of instability provided the perfect, unassailable excuse to have his young son, Robert II, crowned as co-king on Christmas Day of that very same year, 987.
Oh, wow.
The Archbishop of Reims, Adalberon, was actually quite wary of this. He argued you can't have two kings created in the same year, seeing right through the political maneuver, but Hugh forced the issue through.
That is genius, because by doing this, Hugh completely bypasses the dangerous, unpredictable tradition of elective monarchy. When Hugh eventually dies a decade later in 996, there is no gathering of nobles. There is no election. Robert has already been the anointed king for 9 years.
Exactly. It established a biological, hereditary lock on the throne, and the Capetians just kept doing this. Generation after generation, they would crown the eldest son while the father was still alive and ruling.
Just completely removing the element of choice.
Right. This practice, combined with what historians call the Capetian Miracle, which was simply the sheer, improbable biological luck of producing a surviving, healthy male heir for over 300 straight years, turned an elective figurehead position into an ironclad hereditary dynasty.
So they have secured the crown biologically. They have the title, they have the magic oil, and they've rigged the succession rules.
Yes.
But having the crown and actually wielding power are two very different things. A fancy title means absolutely nothing if you get robbed by a minor warlord 5 miles outside your own castle gates. Which transitions us into an era of brutal territorial consolidation and honestly some disastrous family drama.
Oh, absolutely. Because if we look at the reality of those early Capetian kings, Robert II the Pious, Henry I, and Philip I, the Amorous, the situation on the ground was incredibly grim.
I was shocked reading about the 11th century. These kings were virtually prisoners in their own small domain.
Yes, they were.
The sources note that if they left the immediate area around Paris and Orléans, they risked being physically captured and held for ransom by their own supposed vassals.
Right, by the guys who swore fealty to them.
Exactly. They spent over a century just fighting low-level, brutal, muddy turf wars just to control the roads and the local castles within a few dozen miles of Paris.
They were kings who were desperately fighting just to be relevant local lords. Their administration was so embarrassingly poor, so under-resourced, that the royal bureaucracy was virtually non-existent.
I read a detail that really hammered this home. We have historical documents, royal charters outlining land grants, and legal decisions that had to be co-signed by the king's wives.
Yes.
Not because the queens had immense constitutional power, but because the king's staff was so small and uneducated that he literally needed his wife to help handle the basic administrative paperwork of the realm.
It's wild, right? It highlights the intimate, almost domestic scale of the early Capetian government. It wasn't a sprawling state apparatus, it was a family business struggling to keep the lights on.
Yeah.
The dynamic doesn't actually start to shift in a meaningful way until we get to the early 12th century, with Louis VI, known to history as Louis the Fat.
Though he earned that nickname much later in life when he became morbidly obese and couldn't mount a horse.
True.
In his youth, Louis VI was a completely different animal.
He was a tireless, aggressive warrior king. He is really the first Capetian who begins to centralize power with an iron fist. He didn't rely just on magic oil he wrote out personally year after year to physically smash the robber barons who were defying him around Paris.
He actually gets his hands dirty.
Very dirty. He besieged their castles, burned their lands, and forced them into submission. He's also the first French king to actively wage war against the English crown, pushing back against the Norman kings of England who were encroaching on his territory.
He spends his entire reign fighting in the mud. And by the end of it, he has finally made the King of France the undisputed master of his own backyard. The roads around Paris are finally safe.
Dial.
And right at the end of his life, Louis VI thinks he has pulled off the ultimate dynastic coup that's going to catapult his family into a superpower. Which brings us to one of the most consequential and catastrophic family dynamics in medieval history.
Oh, this is where it gets so good. In 1137, just weeks before he dies of dysentery, Louis VI arranges for his son and heir, Louis VII the Young, to marry the greatest, wealthiest heiress in all of Europe, Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Let's talk about Aquitaine, because I don't think people realize the scale. Aquitaine is massive. It encompasses the entire southwestern chunk of modern France. It is significantly richer, vastly more cultured, and much larger geographically than the French king's own royal domain.
It's a game changer. On paper, it is a geopolitical masterstroke. Through this single marriage, the Capetians would instantly double their territory, their wealth, and their military capacity. But the reality was an absolute, unmitigated personality clash that doomed the project from the start.
Because Louis VII and Eleanor were fundamentally incompatible human beings. Louis VII was a deeply morose, lugubrious, intensely pious man.
Extremely pious.
I learned he was actually raised for the church and only became the secular heir when his older brother died in a freak accident. He fell off a horse after a pig ran out into the street in Paris.
The infamous pig incident, yes.
But Louis VII always had the mindset of a monk.
And Eleanor, on the other hand, was raised in the vibrant, highly cultured, sun-drenched courts of the South. Aquitaine was the birthplace of troubadour culture, of courtly love, of poetry and secular arts.
A totally different vibe.
Exactly. She was brilliant, demanding, politically astute, and used to being listened to. She famously complained to her contemporaries that she had married a monk, not a king.
Which brings us to a massive turning point, and honestly a question I had while looking at these sources. We have this cautious, deeply pious, monk-like king in Louis VII. Why on earth does this guy decide to leave his fragile kingdom, take his unhappy wife, and lead a massive, highly dangerous military campaign across the known world to the Middle East?
It wasn't a calculated geopolitical expansion, It was a response to a moment of profound existential panic in Western Christendom. In 1144, the Crusader state of Edessa, one of the key territories established during the First Crusade, fell to the Muslim armies of Zengi.
And the news just horrifies Europe.
Completely. There was a prevailing apocalyptic terror that this was the wrath of God, the beginning of the end for Christian control of the Holy Land.
Right.
The Pope at the time, Eugenius III, was actually in exile in France. To rally the massive spiritual fervor and military manpower needed for a Second Crusade, they turned to one of the most influential figures of the era, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux.
Okay, let's unpack this guy. The sources describe Bernard as this tall, haggard fanatic, his body just racked with pain from years of extreme ascetic fasting. He sounds terrifying.
Bernard was a tireless zealot, completely unshackled from any sense of political moderation. When he preached the call for the Second Crusade at Vézelay, the emotional response was overwhelming. People were tearing their clothes to make crosses.
Wow.
Now, other monarchs had excuses to stay home. The Holy Roman Emperor was dealing with internal rebellion. The King of England was fighting a brutal civil war known as the Anarchy.
So it all falls on Louis.
Exactly. The spiritual burden and the promised glory fell squarely onto the shoulders of the pious Louis VII. He takes the cross, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, as a powerful ruler in her own right, insists on going with him, bringing her own vassals.
And it is an absolute unmitigated disaster from start to finish. I want to drill into the mechanics of why this crusade failed so spectacularly, because it wasn't just bad luck.
No, it was a mess.
They gather this massive, somewhat unruly army. They march across Europe into Byzantine territory, and almost immediately, the alliance structure breaks down.
Louis was gripped by paranoid, perhaps somewhat justified, delusions that the Byzantine Greeks were constantly betraying him, feeding information to the Turks.
So they cross into Anatolia without proper Byzantine logistical support, and they suffer horribly. The supply lines vanish. They're dealing with thirst, starvation, and these relentless, highly mobile, hit-and-run attacks by Turkish light cavalry.
Right. The heavy French knights simply couldn't maneuver in that terrain.
It's a total mismatch. By the time they actually reach the Holy Land, the army is a battered, exhausted shadow of its former self. And their grand strategic move to turn the tide. They decide to lay siege to Damascus.
A siege that lasted exactly 4 days.
4 days. Why? How do you march across the world for a holy war and give up in less than a week?
It was a cascade of tactical blunders and shifting local alliances. The Crusaders initially attacked through the dense orchards outside the city, which provided cover but completely bogged down their forces. Then, fearing a relief army was coming, they inexplicably shifted their camp to the other side of the city, a barren, waterless plain with no defensive cover.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Right. Without water, and facing rumors that the local Christian lords of Jerusalem had been bribed by the Damascenes to sabotage the siege, morale completely collapsed.
So they lost their nerve, broke the siege, and retreated in total abject shame.
Utter humiliation.
It was a humiliation on a global scale. They hadn't regained a single inch of territory. They just wasted thousands of lives and a massive amount of royal treasure.
What's fascinating here is how this immense geopolitical and spiritual failure acts as the direct catalyst for the collapse of the royal marriage.
Yes, the fallout is insane.
The tension between Louis and Eleanor had been brewing for years, exacerbated by the miseries of the Crusade and Eleanor's own vocal, strategic disagreements with Louis's military command. There were even rumors she had an affair with her uncle in Antioch.
Scandalous.
Very. So shortly after they returned to France in disgrace, Eleanor forces the issue. In 1152, they officially annul the marriage.
Okay, wait, let's talk about the grounds for this annulment. They used consanguinity. That just means they were too closely related by blood, right? But wasn't basically every single royal in Europe related at this point? That sounds like a very convenient legal loophole.
It was the ultimate medieval legal loophole. Church law at the time forbade marriage within 7 degrees of consanguinity. If you dug deep enough into the family trees, practically any 2 nobles in Western Europe were technically violating this rule.
So they just pull it out when they need it?
Exactly. It was a tool that could be selectively enforced when a marriage became politically or personally untenable. Louis wanted a male heir, which Eleanor hadn't produced, and Eleanor wanted out. So they cited their distant shared ancestry, and the church granted the annulment.
But this isn't just a simple breakup. Think of this like a disastrous corporate merger. They annul the marriage, but the departing partner doesn't just leave quietly with a severance package.
Not at all.
Eleanor takes her massive, lucrative territory, Aquitaine, and within 8 weeks, she walks it directly over to the French king's absolute worst rival. She marries the young, dynamic Duke of Normandy, the future King Henry VI of England.
It is staggering when you look at the map before and after this event.
It's just a sea of red for England.
Yes. Henry already controlled Normandy, Maine, and Anjou. When he marries Eleanor, he absorbs Aquitaine. He now controls an Angevin empire that stretches seamlessly from the borders of Scotland all the way down to the Pyrenees Mountains in Spain.
Wow.
Henry II, who is technically a vassal to the French king for his lands in France, now holds vastly more French land and vastly more wealth than the French king himself.
It is the ultimate geopolitical nightmare for the Capetians. Louis II spent the rest of his 43-year reign locked in ultimately profitless, exhausting warfare with Henry II, just trying to hold the line and survive.
Just barely clinging on.
But incredibly, the Capetian dynasty doesn't die here. In fact, they rebound spectacularly.
They do. We move now from the humiliation of the Second Crusade to the absolute cultural and political apogee of the Capetian dynasty.
Let's talk about that, because how do they pivot?
It's a testament to a fundamental shift in strategy. They realized that when the Capetians couldn't win by brute military force against a behemoth like the Angevin Empire, they had to win through institution building, soft power, and cultural hegemony.
The cultural legacy, right. The Capetian Renaissance is truly staggering. How do they actually do it?
They reshape the intellectual and physical landscape of Europe. It is under the later years of Louis VII and continuing heavily into the reign of his son Philip II that Paris is deliberately transformed into the center of the world.
And this is when they build the big one, right?
Yes. In 1163, the foundation stone of Notre Dame Cathedral is laid. And it's supposedly laid by Pope Alexander III, whom Louis VII was politically protecting from the Holy Roman Emperor. It was a massive statement of divine favor and architectural supremacy.
And we also see the founding of the University of Paris right around this time, growing out of the cathedral schools.
Exactly. The University of Paris becomes the intellectual beating heart of Christendom. Scholars from all over Europe flock to Paris to study theology and law.
So they're cornering the market on religion and education.
Right. The Capetians were positioning themselves not just as warlords, but as the premier defenders of faith and reason.
Which sets the stage for Louis VII's son, Philip II, also known as Philip Augustus. And I feel like we need to give this guy his due, because he fundamentally alters the trajectory of the nation.
He's a giant of history.
He does something incredibly symbolic early on. For 200 years, the Capetians had called themselves the King of the Franks. It's a tribal, ethnic, localized title. But Philip II changes the official paperwork. Documents stop saying King of the Franks and begin explicitly using King of France.
It is a monumental linguistic shift, and it's highly intentional. It signals the dawn of a unified national identity.
It feels much more modern.
It does. It is a claim to a geographic, unified nation-state, not just a feudal overlordship of a specific ethnic group. He is claiming sovereignty over the land itself.
But he doesn't just change the letterhead. He actually backs it up by breaking the Angevin Empire. How does he actually beat the English when his father failed for decades?
Philip II was a master of political maneuvering and opportunistic warfare. He constantly exploited the family drama of the Angevins, pitting Henry II's sons, Richard the Lionheart and King John, against their father and against each other.
So letting them tear themselves apart.
Exactly. But the definitive mechanism of his victory culminated in 1214 at the Battle of Bouvines.
Okay, set the scene for this battle.
So King John of England had formed a massive coalition with the Holy Roman Emperor and various Flemish lords to crush Philip from multiple sides. If Philip loses Bouvines, France is likely carved up and the Capetian Dynasty is finished.
Existential stakes.
Completely. But Philip uses superior cavalry tactics and exploits the disorganized command structure of the coalition army. He utterly routs them.
Wow.
This victory permanently shatters the Angevin grip on northern France. Philip reclaims Normandy, Maine, and Anjou directly for the royal crown. He quadruples the royal revenue.
Quadruples it.
Yeah. He isn't a figurehead anymore. He is the undisputed master of Western Europe.
Which creates this incredibly powerful, centralized state for his grandson to inherit. And here's where it gets really interesting. Enter Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, ruling from 1285 to 1314.
Philip the Fair, yes.
If Hugh Capet was the guy trying to survive at a boardroom as a puppet CEO, Philip IV is the ruthless corporate raider who takes over the entire industry, liquidates the competition, and rewrites the laws to suit himself. His centralization of power is unprecedented.
Ruthless is the perfect word. He stops functioning merely as a feudal overlord relying on personal oaths and starts acting like a modern, absolute head of state backed by armies of professional lawyers and bureaucrats.
He needs massive amounts of money to fight his constant wars, particularly in Flanders and Gascony. So what does he do? He bypasses the traditional feudal tax system.
Right.
In 1302, he summons the very first Estates General, bringing together the clergy, the nobility, and the commodores in one assembly, strictly to legitimize his massive, unprecedented tax demands.
It was brilliant, bureaucratically speaking.
And in 1295, he establishes the Old Alliance with Scotland, opening a permanent strategic second front against England.
A classic pincer move.
But his most shocking, earth-shattering power play is against the Church. The papacy, specifically Pope Boniface VIII, tries to tell Philip he cannot tax the French clergy without papal permission. Philip's response is mind-boggling.
It triggers one of the greatest crises in the history of the medieval church.
Explain the mechanism here. How does a secular king actually kidnap God's representative on earth?
It's known as the Outrage of Anagni in 1303. Boniface VIII was preparing to excommunicate Philip IV, which would have absolved all French subjects of their loyalty to the king, a deeply dangerous political threat.
The nuclear option.
Exactly. So Philip decides to strike first. He sends his chief minister, a ruthlessly pragmatic lawyer named Guillaume de Nogaret, into Italy with a band of mercenaries.
A lawyer leading mercenaries, that's amazing.
They infiltrate the town of Anagni, where the Pope is staying. They literally storm the papal palace. Legend has it that one of the mercenary leaders slapped the 73-year-old Pope in the face with his armored gauntlet.
Oh my God.
They hold Boniface hostage for 3 days, demanding he resign. While the local townsfolk eventually rise up and free the Pope, the shock and physical trauma are so severe that Boniface dies a few weeks later.
And Philip doesn't stop there. He essentially buys the papacy in the aftermath.
He does. He coerces the deeply intimidated College of Cardinals into electing a French Pope, Clement V. And then he refuses to let the Pope go to Rome.
He just keeps him in France.
He moves the entire papal seat to Avignon, a city completely surrounded by French territory. For the next 70 years, the Catholic Church is essentially brought directly under French royal control. He captures the moral authority of Europe and turns it into a department of the French government.
It's an unbelievable power grab. But this ruthless drive for wealth and absolute control brings us to the most infamous episode of his reign, heavily layered with symbolism, myth, and extreme violence, the destruction of the Knights Templar.
Yes.
I think a lot of people know the Templars from movies as holy warriors, But at this point in history, they were essentially the billionaire international bankers of the Middle Ages, right?
Exactly. After the Crusader states fell, the Templars retreated to Europe. They had a massive network of castles, vast agricultural estates, and they had developed early systems of international credit and banking.
You could deposit gold in Paris and withdraw it in London.
Right. They were incredibly wealthy, deeply secretive, and answered only to the Pope. And Philip IV owed them a fortune from financing his wars.
So if you are a ruthless, absolute monarch, and you owe a massive debt to an independent banking cartel operating inside your borders, what do?
You wipe them out.
On Friday, October 13th, 1307, Philip orders the sudden, highly coordinated arrest of every single Templar in France. He seizes their staggering assets to pay off his royal debts. The trials drag on for years, involving horrific torture by royal inquisitors, forcing the knights to confess to wildly fabricated charges of heresy, idol worship, and spitting on the cross.
It was a complete institutional liquidation. Finally, in 1314, Philip has the Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, slowly burned at the stake on an island in the Seine in Paris.
And this is where the famous myth comes in. According to the legend, as de Molay was burning, the flames rising around him, he cursed Philip V and the compliant Pope Clement V, summoning them both to appear before the judgment seat of God within a single year.
The famous Templar curse.
And then within a month, Pope Clement was dead of disease. Less than a year later, Philip V, the Iron King, suffered a stroke while hunting and died of dysentery.
It's dear.
Now, it's an incredible story, and it is entirely easy to see why the medieval mind jumped straight to a supernatural curse. But let's look at this with the lens of statecraft. I'm going to push back on the folklore here. I don't buy the curse narrative at all. Philip IV didn't fall to a supernatural hex from a dying monk. He fell because his ruthless, heavy-handed centralization alienated the nobility, alienated the clergy, and completely hollowed out the traditional feudal bonds of loyalty that his ancestors relied on.
That's a fair point.
He created a state that looked incredibly powerful and wealthy on the outside, but was actually a brittle, over-centralized political machine. It was primed to shatter at the very first sign of internal weakness.
From a modern structural perspective, you are absolutely right. The over-centralization created immense political friction. But let me play devil's advocate for the medieval mindset here.
Sure.
If you're a peasant or even a noble in 1314, you don't see bureaucratic overreach. You watch the Grand Master of a holy order burn at the stake. You hear rumors of this terrifying final curse. And then, incredibly, within months, the Pope and the seemingly invincible Iron King both drop dead.
It looks pretty convincing.
It does. You can see why this permanently terrified the medieval psyche. It felt like divine retribution for Philip's hubris, and whether it was a curse or just brittle statecraft, the moment Philip V dies, the illusion of unshakable Capetian stability shatters instantly.
It completely implodes, and what's wild is that it doesn't implode from a foreign invasion. And it doesn't implode from a massive rebellion of the lords. It implodes from a catastrophic, humiliating family scandal that strikes at the very heart of their power, their meticulously crafted biological legitimacy.
The Capetian Miracle, that unbroken string of fathers and sons, was the foundation of their authority. They spent 3 centuries ensuring uncontested succession.
Right.
They had 3 strong adult sons lined up when Philip V died: Louis X, Philip V, and Charles V. It looked like the dynasty was secure for another century.
But then comes the Tour de Nestlé affair, the absolute scandal of the century. Set the scene for us here, because this is where the family dynamics tear the state apart.
The year is 1314, right at the end of Philip V's life. Philip has a highly intelligent, politically formidable daughter named Isabella, who is married to King Edward II of England. She is known to history as the She-Wolf of France.
A great nickname.
On a diplomatic visit to Paris, Isabella notices something highly suspicious. Sometime previously, she had given beautifully embroidered silk purses as gifts to her sisters-in-law, Marguerite, Blanche, and Joan, the wives of her 3 brothers, the future kings of France.
Oh, okay, so these are custom, highly recognizable royal accessories.
Exactly. But during a banquet, Isabella sees these specific recognizable purses being carried not by her sisters-in-law, but by 2 dashing Norman knights, the Donnet brothers.
I mean, to use a modern corporate analogy again, this is like finding out that your company's supposedly secure master passwords have been secretly used by 2 mid-level interns for the last 3 years.
Yes.
It completely compromises the integrity of the entire system.
That is a perfect way to put it, because in a hereditary monarchy, the queen's fidelity is the master password to the state's security. Isabella informs her father, the king. Philip V secretly sets a watch on the Tour de Nesle, a dark, imposing guard tower on the banks of the Seine in Paris.
And what do they find?
What his agents discover is politically explosive. The wives of the future kings of France have been using the tower to carry on passionate, long-running affairs with these knights.
The fallout is absolutely apocalyptic. The visceral punishment they mete out is staggering.
It is brutal, designed to be a terrifying public deterrent. The Donnet brothers are arrested, subjected to horrific torture, castrated, flayed alive, broken on the wheel, and their mutilated bodies are hung on a public gibbet.
Just unmanageably gruesome.
And the women are publicly humiliated, their heads are shaved to mark them as adulteresses, and they are thrown into a freezing subterranean dungeon in the fortress of Chateau Gaillard. Joan is eventually cleared of direct adultery and returns to her husband, but Marguerite and Blanche are condemned to life in prison.
And this isn't just tabloid gossip. Marguerite is married to Louis X, the eldest son, the immediate heir to the throne. Philip IV dies shortly after this. Marguerite is sitting in a dungeon, and suddenly, Louis X becomes king of France.
A king with a disgraced, imprisoned wife.
Right. He desperately needs to remarry to produce a legitimate male heir, but the Pope is dead, and the papal electoral machinery is stalled, so he can't easily get a religious annulment. Then, incredibly conveniently, Marguerite mysteriously dies in her freezing prison cell.
What a coincidence.
Strangled on the king's orders, many contemporaries claimed, clearing the way for Louis to immediately remarry Clementia of Hungary.
If we connect this visceral family drama to the bigger picture, the Tour de Nesle affair doesn't just destroy a family, it destroys the foundational premise of the Capetian state.
The legitimacy.
Their entire legitimacy rested on uncontested, direct male descent. But because Marguerite was caught in a long-term adulterous affair, the paternity of her only child, a daughter named Joan, is entirely suspect.
No one knows who the father is.
Right. No one in France knows if she carries the sacred royal blood of the Capetians or the blood of a dead, flayed knight.
And this triggers an existential crisis that unravels the whole dynasty. Louis X rules for only 2 years before dying suddenly after a game of tennis in 1316.
Tennis.
Yeah. He leaves behind his pregnant new wife, Clementia. The kingdom holds its breath. She gives birth to a boy, John I, known as John the Posthumous. He is king from the exact moment of his birth. But he lives for only 5 days.
5 days.
Suddenly, for the first time in over 300 years, there is no direct male heir. The only child left from Louis X's line is Joan, the daughter of the adulterous Marguerite. The kingdom faces an unprecedented question. Does the crown go to a woman? Especially a woman who might be a bastard.
The French magnates are terrified of this prospect. They fear civil war and they fear being ruled by a potential illegitimate child. Louis X's ambitious younger brother, the Count of Poitiers, orchestrates a swift, highly organized power grab to bypass Joan and crown himself as King Philip V.
But he needs a legal reason, right?
Exactly. A naked power grab looks bad. He needs a legal justification to explicitly bypass a female heir. So the royal lawyers frantically dig deep into the archives. They resurrect an obscure, ancient legal code called Salic law.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Salic law is famous, but the context is ridiculous. Salic law was an ancient tribal code from the early Merovingian days, written centuries before the Capetians even existed.
Centuries.
It dictated how private property, specifically land, was divided among Frankish tribesmen, stating that women could not inherit ancestral land. The French lawyers dust off this archaic rule, completely rip it out of its original context, and elevate it to a fundamental, unbreakable law of the kingdom, explicitly claiming it means women are forever banned from inheriting the throne of France.
It's totally made up on the spot.
Going back to our corporate analogy, this is exactly like a panicked board of directors frantically rewriting the company's foundational bylaws in the middle of a hostile takeover weekend. They aren't doing it out of deep legal principle or constitutional reverence. They're doing it specifically to keep one exact person, Joan, out of the CEO chair.
It is entirely reactionary. Philip V uses this fabricated precedent to take the throne. But ironically, the curse of the direct line strikes him too.
Oh, of course.
He rules for 6 years and dies leaving only daughters. Because he personally established the unbreakable precedent of Salic law to steal the crown, his own daughters are now barred from inheriting.
The irony is rich.
Right. So the crown passes to the youngest brother, Charles IV.
And it happens again.
Exactly. Charles IV dies in 1328, and he too leaves only daughters. The direct Capetian line, which had enjoyed an unbroken, miraculous string of fathers and sons for over 3 centuries, goes completely extinct in a span of just 14 chaotic years.
And this is where the rushed, panicked weaponization of Salic law completely backfires and burns France to the ground. Because when Charles I dies in 1328, the direct male line is gone. Who is the closest male blood relative to the deceased king?
It is King Edward III of England.
The English king.
He is the son of Isabella, the she-wolf of France. Through his mother, he is the direct, legitimate grandson of Philip the Fair. By standard feudal inheritance norms used everywhere else in Europe, his claim to the French throne is incredibly strong.
But the French lords absolutely refused to be ruled by an English king. They just spent centuries fighting the Angevins. They aren't going to hand over the crown voluntarily.
No.
So they pull out their trump card, Salic law, again. But they have to stretch it even further. They argue that not only can a woman not inherit the throne herself, but a woman cannot transmit the claim to the throne to her son.
You're just moving the goalposts.
Exactly. The sacred royal blood, they argue, cannot pass through a female line at all. They reject Edward III's claim outright, and instead they crown a cousin through the male line, Philip of Valois, officially starting the Valois dynasty.
And Edward III, who is a powerful, ambitious king in his own right, is furious. He rejects this blatant legal maneuvering. His pursuit of his hereditary claim to the French throne is the direct spark that ignites the 100 Years' War.
So the direct line is dead, and their realm is plunged into over a century of devastating apocalyptic warfare, famine, and plague. But it raises a profound question when we look at the whole arc. Did the Capetians actually lose? The dynasty fell, but we have to look at their permanent footprint on European history.
Their legacy is monumental, and it was deeply polarizing in its own time. Culturally, they scarred the medieval psyche. Look at the Italian poet Dante Alighieri.
Oh, Dante.
In his masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, Dante places Hugh Capet, the founder of the dynasty, in purgatory, in Canto 20, among those being punished for the grave sin of avarice.
Dante really hated them, didn't he?
He despised them. He refers to Hugh Capet as the root of the obnoxious plant that shadows all the Christian lands. Dante blames the Capetians for corrupting the papacy. Remember Philip V kidnapping the Pope and moving the church to Avignon, and for ruining Italian politics by constantly interfering?
Which affected Dante personally.
Directly. It caused Dante's own tragic political exile from his beloved Florence. To the intellectuals of the era outside of France, the Capetians weren't divine healers. They were a sprawling, corrupting vine that choked out the light of Christendom.
So what does this all mean for us today? Dante might have hated them, but the Capetians achieved a level of geopolitical penetration that is almost difficult to comprehend. The researchers at Oxford University ran the numbers, and they found a staggering statistic. 75% of all royal families in European history are related in some direct way to the Capetian dynasty.
75%. It is a genetic hegemony over the continent.
And it wasn't just in the past. Their cadet branches continued their work. What exactly is a cadet branch, or context?
A cadet branch is simply a line of descent originating from the younger sons of a royal family. Since the eldest son got the crown, the younger sons were given titles and lands, and they started their own noble houses.
Okay, so the backups.
Right. The House of Valois, the House of Bourbon, the House of Orleans, these are all cadet branches of the Capetians.
And those cadet branches continued to rule France, virtually uninterrupted, until the monarchy was finally abolished in the 19th century.
Yes.
And it goes further than that, right into the modern day. Capetian descendants sit on thrones to this very moment. King Philippe VI of Spain is a direct Capetian descendant through the Bourbon line.
Incredible.
Grand Duke Guillaume V of Luxembourg is a Capetian. There are pretenders still seriously claiming royal titles in Brazil, in Parma, in the Two Sicilies, all tracing their direct lineage back to that one minor lord who snagged a weak puppet crown in 987 and had the luck to have a son.
They succeeded in their ultimate goal, institutional and dynastic immortality. A family that started as kings without a kingdom, terrified to even leave the safety of their own small wooden castles around Paris, managed to use a potent mix of religious myth-making, highly strategic if sometimes disastrous marriages, and brutal, unyielding institutional reform to literally build the modern French nation-state from the ground up.
It is a breathtaking historical arc. We've gone from Vikings sailing up the sand to magic holy oil to catastrophic crusades, murdered Templars, and scandalous affairs in Dark Towers. But as we wrap up this deep dive into the source material, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative irony to ponder.
Let's hear it.
For over 300 years, the Capetian kings were utterly obsessed with securing their unbroken father-to-son male lineage. It was their defining characteristic. It was the biological miracle that prevented the civil wars that constantly tore apart the rival kingdoms of England and Jerusalem.
The cornerstone of their state.
Right. Yet when that lineage finally failed, it was their own desperate, panicked, last-minute weaponization of Salic law, a legal fiction explicitly dug up to protect their male-only legacy and keep the crown in the family that provided the exact legal justification for the Hundred Years' War.
Yeah, that's wild.
The very tool they used to try and save their dynasty brought unprecedented, unimaginable devastation to the very nation they had spent 3 centuries meticulously building.
It is the ultimate historical tragedy. They built a political machine so rigid and so fiercely protective of its own power that when it finally broke, it took the whole country down with it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning the historical narratives you think you know, and we'll catch you next time.